Hello everyone, welcome back to our third session of our first day of the Colloquium. I hope you all managed to get a break, and welcome to anyone who's joining us now. We are about to launch into our third session with three speakers, in fact 4 speakers in this session. And just as a reminder for those that have already been with us, but for new members of the audience, speakers will talk for around 20 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for you to ask them questions through the Q&A button, which you'll find on the right-hand side of the slide. If you click that button, it will open up a bar where you can type in any question, and then I'll be able to pass those on to the speaker at the end of the talk. So please do take advantage of that. So launching our third session, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Augusta McMahon from the University of Chicago, who is joining us today to talk about, actually not Ur, but al-Ubaid and the Ubaid period. So welcome, Augusta. Thank you very much for being part of this colloquium.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you to all the conference organizers. And now let's have the moment of truth. Sharing the screen. And if someone can confirm to me that that is looking okay. Hopefully audibly, because I can't actually see everyone. Does that look good? Someone say yes or no?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So anyway, thank you to all the conference organizers, and also, of course, thanks to Leonard Woolley for his dedication to the archaeology of Iraq and Mesopotamia, and also for his detailed record keeping and very innovative ideas. So the Ubaid period of the 6th to 5th millennia BC marks the earliest known permanent settlement of the southern delta and alluvial plains of Iraq, and developments during this period were foundational to Mesopotamian culture. Many aspects of southern Mesopotamian settlement patterns, economic strategies, craft production, and religious space were established during the Ubaid period and persisted, although with some changes, to the 1st millennium BC. So this paper will offer a quick review of some past developments in our knowledge of the Ubaid period in southern Mesopotamia, including the contributions of Woolley's excavations at Tel al-Ubaid and at Ur, and then we'll suggest some remaining questions. So the Ubaid period was named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid, which is about 7.5 kilometers just west-northwest of Ur, and within Ur's larger hinterland. And at both Tel al-Ubaid and Ur, the Ubaid levels appear to be the earliest occupation at the site, and they're followed by millennia of later occupation, particularly at Ur, which testifies to the site's advantageous location and available resources. So excavations at Tel al-Ubaid began in 1919, directed by Hall, and then were expanded in 1923 to 24 by Leonard Woolley. Woolley then excavated Ubaid period deposits at Ur in 1929 to 30, mainly in Pit F near the Royal Cemetery. And the importance of the Ubaid period as established by these initial excavations was underlined by excavations during 1946 to 49 at nearby Eridu by Fuad Safar, Muhammad Ali Mustafa, and Seton Lloyd. And this set of early excavations at Ubaid, Ur, and Eridu are really the foundation of our understanding of the Ubaid and have allowed archaeologists to assess the Southern Plains' first permanent occupation, to define Ubaid style in pottery and other forms of material culture, and to establish the first basic Ubaid chronological sequence. So during Hall's work at Tel al-Ubaid, his focus was on the early dynastic temple, and his very large-scale excavations there are still visible in modern aerial images. He collected Ubaid ceramics from the surface, but did not actually excavate contexts of this period, and as was typical of the time, he only collected the decorated sherds. Woolley then subsequently excavated a limited area of Ubaid period reed and pisé houses at Tel al-Ubaid, just southeast of the early dynastic temple, where the arrow is showing. And he collected both painted and non-painted pottery, but albeit in a somewhat unscientific manner that was typical of the time. So both Hall and Woolley described the Ubaid ceramics, noting things like their hardness, the green color that many of them have, and the black painted decoration. and both associated the decorative motifs with similar pottery that was known at the time from sites in Elam, such as Susa. Now, Hall did not assess the Ubaid assemblage in any detail, but Woolley did describe some of the variations that he saw in clay fabric, in the temper, and in the potting technique, and he did define some distinct forms as well as decorative motifs. But Hall and initially Woolley treated all the Ubaid pottery as this single prehistoric or pre-Sumerian category, and really as just a single chronological phase based on what they could see. Now, given the limited knowledge of the prehistory of Mesopotamia at the time, this is entirely understandable. But when Woolley then tackled the Ubaid period at Ur, which is in Pit F near the Royal Cemetery, he realized that there were some temporal changes. And so he divided the Ubaid material into 3 phases, 1, 2, and 3, based mainly on stratigraphy, on absolute elevations above the plain level, and some changes in the pottery that he recovered from rubbish layers and from burials. And we've seen this cross-section multiple times already today. So as we learned earlier as well about the flood stratum from Reed Goodman's flood stratum of about 3.5 meters in Pit F separates Woolley's Ubaid 1 from his 2 and 3. And Woolley identified Ubaid 1 as just a small settlement with reed houses, while Ubaid 2 and 3 were represented by graves. And he separated 2 and 3 from each other by differences in the grave good assemblages and in broader changes in the ceramics. And in general, Ubaid 2 pottery had more elaborate decoration, and Ubaid 3 had simpler decoration. So Woolley's early attempt at dividing the Ubaid was useful, but is very difficult to replicate. And it's challenging in particular to reconstruct his grave assemblages for further analysis, because he used the same method as he had in some other publications of illustrating standard types rather than exact grave context. So these are some examples of these general type illustrations. And again, this is typical of the time, but is somewhat problematic for closer modern analysis. Woolley's distinction of body position in the burials, which he claimed were extended in the Ubaid 2, in his Ubaid 2 period, and flexed in Ubaid 3, and his suggestion that weapons were more frequent in graves in the Ubaid 3 also appear to be somewhat anecdotal. And his fortunately brief reconstruction of a wave of Uruk invaders from the north who overwhelmed the impoverished post-flood Ubaid peoples should probably now be placed in the dustbin of history. Now, despite the challenges, several brave scholars have reanalyzed the graves from Woolley's Ubaid 2 and 3 at Ur, starting with Peter Paul Vertasalyi. And he reworked the stratigraphy and the chronology based on detailed examination of publications and analyses of forms, and especially of decorative motifs. And he proposed 4 phases versus Woolley's 3, each with several different subphases and a complicated set of overlapping styles. Following this, Luca Volpi's very recent division of the Ur-Ubaid ceramics into groups of types with differing degrees of frequency and longevity is really a model of what can be done by critical examination of older but very detailed field records such as Woolley produced, together with comparison to materials in museum collections and from more recent excavations. And Luca's definition of 4 ceramic groups underlines the complexity of the transition between Ubaid and the following Uruk period, adding solid evidence for the material culture at the end of the Ubaid period. And these recent analyses, just to jump earlier back in time, these recent analyses of the Ur-Ubaid period materials were enabled by the 1940s temple sounding and hut sounding excavations at Eridu, and then also supplemented by deep soundings at Uruk and at Tel Aker, plus excavations of single period sites such as Hati Muhammad. And all of these excavations had revealed already a more detailed sequence, and especially showed that there was earlier settlement in southern Mesopotamia than what Woolley had excavated at Tel Ubaid and at Ur. And Safar, Mustafa, and Lloyd actually considered that the earliest materials that they recovered from Eridu were distinct enough from those that followed that they should be considered actually pre-Ubaid. They thus identified an Eridu phase in the temple sounding, and then an overlapping Haji Muhammad phase, which other scholars, such as Harriet Crawford, has argued is more a style than a chronological or temporal phase. And it was only really levels 13 and above that they considered to be Ubaid, separating these into standard and late Ubaid. Ceramic chronology aside, the temple sounding at Eridu is also our best evidence for the expansion of temple architecture, probably reflecting the growth of religious power from the early Ubaid into the Uruk period and then beyond. So after the excavations at Eridu, Ubaid, and Ur, a phasing system was developed based mainly on changes in ceramic decorative styles and forms, but also incorporating tools, figurines, and architecture. And that 1940s sequence on the left of Eridu, Haji Muhammad, Standard Ubaid, and Late Ubaid was revised into Ubaid 1 through 4 by Joan Oates, then Joan Lines, for her University of Cambridge PhD in 1953. And she argued that persistence in pottery forms from Ubaid 1 and 2 into 3, plus overlaps in decorative motifs, suggested cultural continuity rather than the separation that the Eridu team had proposed. So the Ubaid 1 to 4 sequence, and our knowledge of the earliest Ubaid in particular, was then supplemented in the 1980s by the excavations at Tel Uwaili of Jean-Louis Huot and his team. And at Uwaili, an even earlier occupation was identified, which was labeled Ubaid 0. Then further materials from Uwaili, plus reanalyses of materials from other excavations and earlier excavations, including Woolley's Ubaid 3 at Ur, have led other scholars to identify a terminal Ubaid or Ubaid 5 phase. So these numbers are now the labels that are used most often for southern Mesopotamian Ubaid materials. And that Ubaid 0 settlement at Uwaili had substantial tripartite buildings that were very different from the reed huts that were identified as the earliest context at Eridu and at Ur. So these very much contradict the assumption that the earliest occupation of the Delta Plain was somehow primitive or only really semi-permanent. So currently there are not many excavations of Ubaid contexts in South Iraq, but exciting work on the Ubaid 2 to 4 is underway at Tel Zorgol, and this site was, of course, ancient Negan in the 3rd millennium BC and part of the Lagash city-state, but it was clearly an important site in the Ubaid period also. And the Iraqi-Italian team there has identified a possible temple of Ubaid 4 date on their Mount B, and its niched and buttressed facade and a set of painted censers comparable to ones that were found at Eridu suggest a ritual function. Plus, a new Iraqi-Italian-French project at Eridu includes excavation of the Ubaid occupation and should soon be generating further important results. Now, I haven't yet mentioned the Ubaid in the Gulf or in northern Mesopotamia, as these are just too large to include here, but would like to note that excavations in North Iraq, in Northeast Syria, and now in the Kurdistan region of Iraq are an incredibly important counterpoint to southern Ubaid developments, particularly expressing the significant heterogeneity in terms of affinities, economies, and regional and sub-regional interactions. But returning to recent work on the Ubaid period in the south, in southern Mesopotamia, Khalid Abu Jayab and Elizabeth Gibbon have recently used principal component analysis and network analysis on the presence-absence of pottery forms and decorative patterns to examine things like communities of practice and ways of manufacturing across southern and northern Mesopotamia during the Ubaid 3 to Ubaid 5 LC1. And their analysis suggests that there was substantial Ubaid 3 stylistic cohesion across this enormously massive region, especially in decoration, but also in forms. And they proposed this was potentially driven by mobility, by migration, and adoption or emulation. And this cohesion in the Ubaid 3 period was followed by gradual dissolution in Ubaid 4, particularly in terms of there being fewer shared forms, a situation which is then magnified in the LC1 or Ubaid 5. So after this very quick summary of Woolley's and more recent research that builds on Woolley's results, what are the most important impacts of the Ubaid period? So beyond being the basis for chronology and phasing, Ubaid ceramics offer us evidence of significant craft specialization. The very best Ubaid pottery is, oh, sorry, that just changed. Are we still good? Hopefully we're still good. So the best Ubaid pottery is very highly fired with kiln temperatures that have been estimated anywhere between 900 to 1000 degrees centigrade or 1050 to 1150 degrees centigrade. And the forms are standardized to a certain degree. Oh, no, something has gone horribly wrong. I do apologize. I can't go forward. Maybe go here, and hopefully, is that gone forward? Yes, okay. Following on to this, Andrew Moore and Tony Wilkinson's very brief surface surveys of Tel Ubaid and Eridu in 1990 had identified large areas with very dense ash and Ubaid 3 to 4 pottery wasters at the surface, suggesting workshop clustering and production of pottery at a very large scale. So these potential production areas match other areas of clustered kilns, such as those excavated by Sabah Jassim at Tel Abada in the Hamreen, and some evidence of kilns at the site of Haji Muhammad as well. Further to this, examination of manufactured traces on many late Ubaid vessels suggests that they were wheel-made, and there is an example from Pit F at Ur that indicates that Ubaid potters had and used tournettes, or these very early potter's wheels. And the invention of the potter's wheel, even the slow wheel, does mean that vessels could be made quickly and thus can also be associated with increased demands for rapidly produced products. So ceramic production appears to be specialized already in the Ubaid period and potentially easing towards full-time in terms of labor, potentially in response to larger populations in larger settlements. And further, the presence of granaries at Tel Ubaid in several of the Ubaid levels from early through late suggests the production of agricultural surpluses, which will be then foundational to the Mesopotamian economy through the first millennium BC. However, the interplay between irrigation agriculture and exploitation of the resources of nearby marshy areas remains to be examined and integrated into more robust models. So the excavations at Ubaid also underlined the importance of pigs in the economy there, while the discovery of fish bones in Ubaid contexts at virtually every site reinforces the importance of marsh or canal or river exploitation for Ubaid period subsistence. So it becomes clear that a very wide-ranging and flexible subsistence base, not just traditional irrigation agriculture, was crucial to the success of Ubaid settlements. The temple sounding at Eridu also showed that the growth of the temple as a physical space and the increased power of religion during the Ubaid period, all in the millennium before the Uruk period, which is the one which is most closely associated with hierarchy and social complexity. And further, the relatively new practice of intact burial and the consistent inclusion of pottery in Ubaid period graves at Eridu and at Ur suggests a belief in the afterlife or a need for food during the dead's passage from the world of the dead to the world of the living. Sorry, other way around, from the world of the living to the world of the dead. This burial practice will then persist through most of Mesopotamian history. But perhaps the most important impact of the Ubaid is the underlying landscape and environmental setting that was chosen for Ubaid settlements. So many Ubaid sites, especially those in the delta plains in the area of Ur, Ubaid, and Eridu, were located in the landscape of multiple river channels and fluctuating marshes. So this marshy landscape was already noted in 1927 by Hall and Woolley in regard to Tel Ubaid. And they write that the early dynastic temple platform was located on a low natural rise above the plain, and that the Ubaid cemetery and settlement just southeast of the temple may also have been on a low mound surrounded by marsh. Further, at Ur, Woolley noted that a low mound within a richly resourced marshy environment was also used for the initial Ubaid period settlement there. And he noted that two small Ubaid IV period sites, so late Ubaid sites near Ur, Rejeba, which is about 12 miles to the west-northwest, and Mereja, which is just to the southeast, were also on small low mounds, each approximately 100 meters across and about 2 meters high. And similarly, Safar, Mustafa, and Lloyd proposed that the earliest occupation of Eridu was on a low dune that created an island within a marsh or a gulf tidal basin. And further, the excavators at Tel Ubaid also confirmed that low mounds rising above the Holocene surface were chosen for the earliest Ubaid occupation at Ubaid and other sites nearby. Now, Jenny Pornell has expanded on these earlier, rather impressionistic observations and proposed specifically that these mounds were not on dunes or matted piles of reeds that earlier scholars, including Woolley, had suggested, but on turtlebacks or a very specific form of islands that were created by the meandering of Pleistocene water channels. So these locations were strategic and adaptable for successful life in the very changeable plains during the 6th and 5th millennium. So thus Woolley's initial rather impressionistic observations about Mesopotamia's earliest permanent occupation, based on his excavations at Ur and Ubaid, have proven to be true. And these have an impact not only on Ubaid settlement, but also on our reconstruction of the early cities in Mesopotamia. So we now know that marshy environments supported the growth of some of our largest early dynastic cities, such as Lagash and Girsu. So I want to move next to some remaining questions for the future. And first, what more can we do with ceramic analysis beyond more chronological phasing and more assessment of regional interconnections? So what does it mean for modes of production that decoration was reduced over the Ubaid period? And can we identify functions for specific vessel forms, whether this is for feasting events, for daily use, or for specific types of food or liquids? And are there residues or wear indications that indicate vessel use? And what do the overall assemblages of ceramics, including ratios of open to closed vessels, tell us about diet and past foodways? Susan Pollock has addressed some of these questions for Tel Abada and Madhur in the Hamrin, but it would be interesting to examine these questions for sites that are specifically in these marshy or delta contexts. Second set of question is really, what are the various economic bases of Ubaid settlements? Although very anecdotal, Hall had noted that there were large numbers of sickle blades at Tel Ubaid, and he calls them saw blades here, and then there were fewer at Eridu. By contrast, he recorded that clay sickles and net weights were less common at al-Ubaid than at Eridu, although they were present in Woolley's excavations at al-Ubaid. Further, the evidence from Whaley, as I said, suggests farming and pig herding, while the inhabitants of Ur, Ubaid, and Eridu may have relied more on marsh resources such as reeds and fish. But the tool assemblage that Woolley recovered from Pit F at Ur includes grinding stones, clay sickles and mullers, flint hoes, and obsidian sickle blades. So the balance of fishing, farming, and herding at Ur and these other delta sites remains to be specifically assessed. Further, Woolley mentions that spindle whorls were recovered from Pit F at Ur. Pseudo has explored the transition from flax to wool in northern Mesopotamia, but the early textile production in southern Mesopotamia is also an important area that could use more research. And finally, what were the differences in settlement patterns between the Delta Plain, far south of southern Mesopotamia, and the alluvial plain, sort of northern southern Mesopotamia, if you will? And large-scale surveys such as those of Adams and Wright tended to lump Ubaid 1 through 5 all together because of the knowledge that was of the ceramic at the time. But Adams, Joan Oates, Jenny Pornell, and Carrie Hritz have all at various times noted that the settlements of the earliest phases of the Ubaid, 0 through 2, were really concentrated in the south near Whaley, Ur, Ubaid, and Eridu, while the more northern alluvial plains were only occupied in Ubaid 3 to 4. Much more needs to be done to track this movement very, very specifically, and particularly the difference between potentially the channels of the Tigris and the channels of the Euphrates. Also, what might precede Ubaid 0? So Ubaid 0 at Tel Uwali is really the earliest we know, not necessarily the earliest occupation of the plains. And this question and the relationship between the Samaran and the earliest Ubaid occupations, which were already raised some decades ago by several scholars, but not answered, and this was in the Ubaid conference in 2006, all this deserves further investigation as well. All of these questions do raise the larger issue of whether the Ubaid, at over 2,000 years long and very, very diverse, is really at all cohesive, and whether in fact we should be thinking of additional subdivisions and further deconstruction. So just to conclude, the Ubaid period in southern Mesopotamia was revolutionary in terms of changes in the nature of labor, new social and power organizations and hierarchies, and new human landscape relationships. And in this period, the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia really laid the base on which the cities of the Uruk period and later would be built. But we still have much to do to build out from the work of Woolley and other earlier excavators to clarify these developments and to illuminate the diversity of these early inhabitants of South Iraq. Thank you very much. And stop sharing. Okay, good.
Augusta, thank you very much indeed. That was, again, a wonderful survey of the work of Woolley and how very much, so much now is built on his achievements and others. I invite questions for in the Q&A box, but maybe I can start. I was just intrigued by the specialized ceramic production that's clearly articulated. I just and again that question around the change in decorated to undecorated ware over time, and you didn't touch in your survey on what was happening further north in Mesopotamia, and I mean, again, maybe it's one of those questions, but I just wondered whether you could reflect a bit on those highly decorated ceramics further north and whether that might have had some relationship with what we're seeing in the south.
Yeah, so northern Mesopotamia, this is, it would take another hour to make this happen. And certainly we're learning a lot more. The original sort of traditional assumption was southern Mesopotamia was this complex core, and then there was sort of movement out into northern Mesopotamia that was this less complicated world. And the sort of the borrowing was unidirectional. We now know, of course, that there was a lot more just movement to and fro and much more relationship of equality and exchange. And there are northern Mesopotamian Ubaid forms which end up moving south, and things like stamp seals, which of course are at home in the north, are then moving south, and the whole sort of the way we think about these two regions is very, very different. In terms of the difference between highly decorated and undecorated forms, there's a sort of chronological issue. And it does seem as if as there is greater demand for ceramics and greater demand for speed, there is simply less time which is spent on each individual vessel. And so there's a sort of basic line of that. There's also the issue, though, that some of the most highly decorated, most beautiful vessels, things like the Haji Muhammad ware, are not actually necessarily temporally constrained, but are actually more functionally related. So they are for things like feasting events or events in which you are then basically feeding a lot of people, and then not only sort of wowing them and making them, making an awesome spectacle by mountains of food, but also by this very, very highly decorated, fancy wares as well. So the fact that there are still some highly decorated wares even late can be related potentially to function rather than the sort of mass production. So there's a line of mass production, but there's still this very strong emphasis on elite presentation as well that passes all the way through, and for which there is also an interesting northern-southern dynamic and a lot of sub-regional variations as well.
Thank you. Professor Chapin has added some information that excavations were resumed at Ubaid in 2019 and 2021. So work continuing there, which is very good news. Augusta, thank you so much indeed for your contribution to the colloquium. Wonderful discussion there.